And with that, we will kick off this episode of Combat Kitchen. Welcome. I'm going to overlay some commentary over it so you can hear kind of some of my thoughts that I had as I was performing these tests. One of the first things I noticed is the ESEE didn't puncture super deep on a lot of the cuts unless there was already a cut initiated there. This one's pretty good. But I was hoping that that thin grind slope would really help it bite in a little bit more. And I have to say that it was okay, but it didn't quite do what I was hoping. The top silent hero, on the other hand, rather surprised me with the depths that it reached on these chopping cuts. I'll fade the audio out so you can watch. And there you can see that pretty much the whole blade is buried on that first cut. And for the most part, it only gets better from there. When it came to skinning the pumpkin, I had also really hoped that the ESEE's overall sort of thinner profile of the flat ground blade would result in it peeling the pumpkin well. And to be fair, it did peel the pumpkin a lot easier than my Kabar Becker, and I think it was due to the thinness of the grind. I did find in several of the tests that I performed that the pieces or the shavings that you cut off would be fractured into pieces. And I think as I was looking at the two knives trying to figure out what was causing this, I think that the coating adds an extra, maybe millimeter or so of thickness, and it sort of boosts the behind the edge thickness. There you can see it actually fractured that when trying to split it. And I think that the coating that they put on these ESEEs and the same coating that's on my Kabar maybe led to a pretty similar effect in the two knives when I tested them, in that they behaved like a knife that's thicker behind the edge than the steel itself, because the coating actually adds to that behind the edge thickness. Here's a close-up. I tried to capture some of that fracturing so that you can compare it to what the Tops does later on. here we start with the tops, and to be honest, I was expecting a worse result from the tops because of the thicker grind, but I have to say I feel tops has done an admirable job of keeping it thin enough behind the edge, but still having an edge profile that's pretty durable, because this is actually after twice as much chopping as the ESEE. This tops has done 7 hours of chopping before I did this test. The ESEE has done 3.5 because the tops actually passed the tomato test the first time, so I went on to chop with it for another week. And I have to say, it was actually enjoyable to do the cutting up of this pumpkin. Here's a close-up of some of those shavings, and you can see that there are some lines in them, but there's not nearly the amount of splintering and fracturing that was present in the shavings that came off of the pumpkin when I was using the ESEE. I have to say, overall, the tops has been by far the most enjoyable knife to do these kitchen tests with. However, the one thing that I will say is that the jimping and texturing on the handle is quite aggressive. And although I did a lot of work with this and didn't cause myself a blister, it did definitely make my index finger a bit red and a bit irritated using the tops for a long period of time without gloves. Here you can see how clean the ESEE cut the apple. It's a decent result, not bad. It was hard to keep it straight, which is why I've veered off the center there, but not a bad result for the ESEE. Again, here you can see that there are several pieces that have sort of flaked off and splintered. And if you look at the side of that first slice of apple, you can see there's quite a lot of texture in that a lot of the apple broke before the edge got to it. I'm not sure if that's because of behind the edge thickness, or maybe because the edge doesn't seem to have lasted quite as well on this ESEE through the testing. But I did notice that it was difficult to get a straight cut. Here I'm trying to cut a little flat surface to set it on, and I'm having difficulty getting the angle that I want. This is a test that I refer to as flaking the apple, and I like to cut a flat surface on the bottom and then see how thin of a slice I can get off of it. And the ESEE did pretty well overall on this, although it did seem to slip out when I tried to get those thinner slices. But we can compare that to the tops in a moment. There was a bit of a bruise in both of these apples, so I figured it was a good chance to test out the tip and see how good the tip was at doing fine work. I like to have a bit of a tip on my knives. I don't find myself to be a big fan of sheep's foot or tanto or things like that, partially just because you can't use the tip quite as easily in my experience. I found the tips on both of these to be adequate. The tops was a bit better in this test, as it was on most of the tests, but the ESEE was perfectly serviceable. Now you can definitely still see that there is some breaking. This is obviously not a knife that is made specifically to be thin behind the edge. And so it did keep the cut straight, however, which was difficult for me to do with the ESEE. You can see it went right straight and true down the middle of the core of the apple. This was quite a curious thing, but I found that when I would pop these, it would actually peel off all of the part that I didn't want. And I don't know if that's just a fluke or if that's like perfection of behind the edge thickness, but it was quite easy to pop the core out of these apple pieces. Much cleaner on the sides of these cuts from the regular push cut. As you can see here, I had a much easier time getting the correct angle with the tops, and as you can also see here, I got some very thin flakes off of this apple. It slips out a few times, but then I start to get some pretty astounding results for an outdoors knife. Now, to be honest, this was the test that I was really hoping that the ESEE would perform admirably well at, and I realized that I hadn't choked up on it the first time, and maybe my technique had gotten better over time. So I wanted to go back and give the ESEE another chance. To be honest, I really was hoping that the ESEE would smash all of these tests. And I began to get some slightly better results. I was unable to get the same level of like translucent, thin thickness that I got with the tops without that happening, without it flaking off and falling over. But definitely got some better results from the ESEE going back and trying again. This piece was pretty good. But as you can see, it's maybe a bit difficult to see, but again we have this issue where the thing that I've cut has fractured into little sections because of some aspect of the ESEE's blade. Peeling a carrot was definitely by far easier with the ESEE than it was with my Kabar. My Kabar was a bit miserable at this particular task, and I think it had neither the grind slope nor did it have the behind the edge thickness for this to be an enjoyable task. When I first did this with the ESEE, I thought, oh, here is where we're gonna find that it beats the tops, because it was such an improvement truly over my Kabar Becker BK7. Chopping up the carrot, very enjoyable with the ESEE. This is the moment where I began to be surprised, because to my great surprise, the tops also outperformed the ESEE in the carrot peeling test. I have to say, this was actually even more enjoyable. You can see the flakes there are much thinner. You can see the sliding action is very smooth. You can see my accuracy is better. And so overall, I would have to give the carrot test to the Tops Silent Hero. Now, the test you saw at the beginning of the video was after I had used the Tops and the ESEE for one morning of work each. I had gone out and done a bunch of chopping with them for 3.5 hours. This now is my test of the Tops after 2 full mornings of chopping, and you can see that it does not want to puncture the skin of that tomato. I give it the 5 passes that I usually do. I switch up my method a little bit, but the Tops does not want to initiate a cut after 7 hours until this point where I grab it with my full hand and give it a little bit of extra pressure. Once I do that, you find that the Tops is still quite a keen edge. I go through the entire tomato and it never fails to do a cut. And it even, when I get to the middle piece, I try to take some off of each side and then come back to the middle. And both my Ontario and my Kabar and the ESEE all failed to cut through this middle piece, but the Tops actually does the final middle piece. Alright guys, I figured I'd just do a quick kind of overview of all of the testing that I've done on these first 3 knives. They're all 1095 variants, and I really was interested to do this because so much of the market is dominated by 1095 steel. If you've been following along, you've probably seen some of this stuff, and if all you're interested for is my recommendation, I have tested an SE6. I have tested a Kabar Becker BK7. It's got no handles on it right now because I'm working on a video of rehandling it. And I have tested a Tops Silent Hero. My top recommendation for overall quality and design would be the Tops, followed by the Becker, followed by the ESEE. So if that's what you want, you can stop watching the video here. If you want to get into the nitty-gritty, then stick with me. So you guys have just watched me process a lot of food and do some kitchen work, but I wanted to say that this is the bag of pumpkin that came from that flipping huge pumpkin that I just chopped up. It is massive. It probably weighs about 18 pounds. I felt conviction that I ought to use the pumpkin because it grew in my wife's garden, and so after the test, I didn't have a way to transport it home. I was like, I better just chop it all up. And the proof is in the pudding. I chose to chop it up with the Tops Silent Hero because that was the most enjoyable knife to use for kitchen use. If you want to see the deleted scene of me chopping up most of that pumpkin until my camera's battery dies, you can watch after the end credits, and you'll have a little deleted scene there. I will say that it was a huge pumpkin, so much work, and although the handle is quite aggressive on the tops, and it did irritate my hand a little bit, you can see here my finger is a little bit red, it did not give me a blister even after doing a really intense amount of pumpkin chopping, which is cool. So the first thing we'll talk about is the sheaths. My favorite sheath among these three overall is actually probably the sheath on the Kabar Becker. I don't like how big it is. I think it's kind of overkill. I don't like the plastic slot here, but I find that the tech lock on this ESEE was quite uncomfortable, and I was really scared on this Tops that I was going to cut this strap that is like right in the path of the blade when you put it away. And those were big enough things for me. Like, I think aesthetically, probably the Tops sheath is like more my style, but I think given the limitations of them, the Kabar sheath functionally just makes more sense for me and the work I do. When it comes to handle design, I would say that the Tops and the Kabar are really close. The texture on the Tops really helps keep the knife in your hand for chopping, and it's also a comfortable shape for doing finer work. It is a little bit uncomfortable, as I said, with this texture. The Kabar, I think, probably would win by a hair because it's comfortable for any use. It's comfortable when you're doing detail work. It's not going to come out of your hand when you're chopping. If you wear gloves with the knives, the ESEE is really hard to hold on to with leather gloves. Not so bad with rubber-coated gloves. The Kabar is quite easy to hold on with leather gloves, but with the nylon handles that come with it, it does work its way out of your hand a little slowly with the leather gloves. I forgot to mention that in the other video. With gloved hands, this Tops handle is definitely the winner. It stays in your hand. The texture is comfortable if you have a glove between you and it, and I could use this thing for the work that I do, clearing brush, all day long and not worry about it. As far as looks go, I would say they all have a very distinctive look from one another. The Kabar with the clip point is really a combat-oriented look. The ESEE is really a no-nonsense kind of look and a survival sort of look. The Tops is more of a sort of rugged, I mean, it's quite a wide blade, almost kind of short and edging on like cleaver-like. But I would say I like them all for different things. The finish on the Tops is gorgeous. I think overall, I like the simplicity and the clip point of the Kabar Becker just a little bit more than the others. That's excluding handle. I think the handle is probably much, it's like by far, it's the coolest on the Tops. When I did the outdoors chopping test, I would definitely say that the ESEE was the lowest or least in terms of power. The balance point is a little bit too far in here to get really effective strokes for chopping. I know that's not what it's designed for primarily. That's just an observation that I made. I would say the Kabar and the Tops both performed similarly. But what was impressive is that the design and balance is done so well on the Tops that it performed pretty close to the same as the Kabar with a lot less size overall. In terms of size, the Kabar is a couple inches longer from tip to all the way down to the pommel. So I think overall, in terms of chopping power against efficiency, I would say that the Tops was a pretty clear winner there in terms of power and balance. For edge retention, the Tops and the Kabar were very similar. They both sliced the tomato cleanly with light pressure in the impact zone after 3.5 hours of chopping. They both failed after 7 hours of chopping, but they were both very close. I think from all the things I've observed, I would say the edge retention on the tops seems just a hair better than the Kabar, but it's not a huge and significant difference. For batoning, the Kabar worked well, the tops worked really well, and the ESEE surprisingly was quite difficult for me to baton with. The one problem I had with the tops is that this thin tip seemed to bite into the baton, and it would really prevent all of the energy from going into the piece of wood that you're trying to cut. Here's a picture of 2 samples of chips that came out from when I was batoning with the tops and the ESEE, and you can see the behind the edge thickness across the board in the tests seems a little bit thicker in the ESEE. It seems to chip its way through things a little bit more, where you can see here the smooth texture of what was cut by the tops knife. I think that's due to it maintaining its edge a little bit better, but also the behind the edge thickness being a little bit thinner. For the kitchen test, obviously behind the edge thickness has a huge bearing, and the tops was a really clear winner here. The top silent hero did the peeling the pumpkin, the apple, the carrot, everything. I think it did quite dramatically better than the ESEE, and pretty significantly better than the Kabar as well. I think to wrap everything up, overall for me, I think that the tops silent hero of these knives that I've tested is probably the highest quality knife. Now you're going to pay for that level of quality, but I think the design, the edge retention, the attention to fit and finish, and just the functionality, the efficiency, the size, for me and for the work that I do, I think the tops is probably the best bet in terms of these 3 knives. My goal going forward would be to get a knife that can do those 7 hours of chopping and will still pop the skin of a tomato. That's sort of like a standing goal that I have, and I'd like to meet that eventually in these videos. I hope you enjoyed this information. I hope you enjoy this series. Next up, we've got some stainless steel coming your way. We'll have a Falcon even. We'll have a Bark River with A2. I'm sorry, that's a tool steel, not a stainless. And we'll also have a cold steel SRK that we'll test in these same tests. Anyway, I wish you guys the best. Have a wonderful day today wherever you're at. Wishing you well from a rainy day here in New Zealand, and I'll just say, hey, peace out from the Home Slice.